All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott, and I've been talking JavaScript with you courtesy of Murox's JavaScript 2nd edition. We're on Chapter 13, the beginning of Section 3 in the book. And Section 3 is actually entitled Advanced JavaScript Skills. So ideally, it's the stuff that you'll be getting to toward the end of the semester, and it's stuff that will probably at least further be brought to you again in other classes. So, Chapter 13 begins on page 395, and you can see it's entitled How to Work with Events, Images, and Timers. So, we've done a little bit of DOM scripting in the past, but now we're going to learn some more advanced DOM or document object model scripting techniques. In particular, how to use cross-browser techniques with working with the event object, and how to work with images, and how to use different types of timers. So as we look here at our objectives, create and use a library with cross-browser compatible methods for attaching an event handler, detaching an event handler, and canceling the default action of an event. Preload the images for an application when the images are not automatically loaded with the web page. Use one-time and interval timers in your JavaScript applications. Distinguish between HTML events, mouse events, and keyboard events. Describe the use of cross-browser compatible functions or methods for attaching and detaching event handlers. Describe the use of cross-browser compatible functions or methods for preventing the default action of an event. Describe the use of images and preloaded images in applications like image rollovers and slideshows. Finally, describe these timer methods: set timeout, set interval, clear timeout, and clear interval. And as we get started, just a couple things. I've said this to you several times before. I'm saying it again. Probably a lot of what you hear in this lecture and a lot of what you read in this chapter may not make a whole heck of a lot of sense the first time you hear it. So it's of paramount importance that you read the chapter more than once. Ideally, you will have read it before you go in and listen to the lectures in class. So basically, you can kind of look at it this way, that JavaScript, for lack of better words, kind of sits around and waits for something to happen. Whatever is going to happen is what's known as an event. And there's several different kinds of events that JavaScript can respond to. 3 of them are shown on your screen right now. The first is an HTML event, which is triggered by the HTML page, for example, the onload event. Second, a mouse event, which is triggered by the user's mouse, maybe a mouse over or a mouse out. And third, the keyboard event is triggered by the user's keyboard, so maybe, key down, key up type of thing. Working with events is oftentimes complicated. All right, you need to make sure that your event code works correctly across all browsers. Now, what we'll learn in the last chapter of this book, and what you'll learn in your second semester, you'll take a class on jQuery. And jQuery, which again is a JavaScript library, has a lot of different things for event handling that make some of the stuff you're going to learn right now much more simplified. So, just a couple things that they mention here. All right, we already talked about those events. Here are some of the HTML events. I don't want to read to you. Probably the ones that you're going to be the most concerned with. Well, the load event, if you want something to happen as soon as all the content is loaded in the browser. A lot more in the load than in the unload. Submit, you might put code there, all right, because that's when the submit button is pressed. Reset is for when the reset button is pressed. All right, and the other 2 that you're probably going to be most concerned with are focus and blur. So if you look, for example, let's pretend right now that where it says the browser loads all content in the document, let's pretend this area in here, right there, that was a text box. If my mouse was sitting in there right now, and I decided I was going to take my mouse and click from there maybe into here, which was another text box, then 2 things are going to happen. A focus event will happen on this second text box. But before that, a blur event will happen. All right, because as you lose focus from one field to another, a blur event takes place. The reason that that's important is it is possible, if you want to, that you can put code in there to check to make sure a user has done what you want them to do, and if they have not, you can literally keep them in limbo, so to speak. You can send them right back to the field they were in. Here are some of the mouse events. Again, I don't plan on reading any of those. There's a few other things that are important with a mouse in addition to what you see right here. All right? And these are events, so these are different things that happen. Okay? And we'll look at some of them as the chapter goes on. But there's also other things with a mouse that can be important, like where the X coordinate is on the screen, where the Y coordinate is on the screen. In other words, where is the mouse positioned on the screen? May or may not be important. And finally, here's some keyboard events. So again, events are triggered when the user does something with a mouse or with a keyboard or when some kind of an HTML action has occurred on the page. Event handlers can be attached to any of these events that you've seen so that the handlers run when the events are triggered. Now here's where it gets a little prickly, for lack of better words. And that's because older versions of IE don't do things the way everybody else does. Modern browsers, modern IE, so IE 9 and above, all modern versions of Firefox and Chrome and Safari, Opera, etc., have addEventListener and removeEventListener methods for adding and removing event handlers. Unfortunately, that stuff is not handled the same way in older versions of IE. In older versions of IE, they use the attach event and detach event. If you want to ensure cross-browser compatibility, you really need to check. Chances are pretty good that these are going to be much more prevalent than these are. So typically, if you're going to check, that'll be in your if, and that'll be in your else. All right? So one benefit of using methods is that you can attach multiple event handlers to an element or an event. Also, another benefit is that you can detach event handlers. All right? So the main difference between these two, again, are just the methods that are called. They work pretty much in the same way, but they're calling different methods. So I think there is an example of how you can do that. So you check first for the addEventListener. If it is, boom. Otherwise, you check for the attach event. Newer, older. Newer, older. There's an example or a couple of examples on how you can add multiple event handlers to a single button. Modern browsers send an event object to the event handler that's handling the event. They also provide a DOM-compliant prevent default method. All right? Now, why would you care about a method like that, something that would cancel? Why would you care about canceling a default action? All right? Well, the best example I can give you of canceling a default action is when you click a hyperlink, and if for whatever reason you don't want the user to be going to someplace new, you want to keep them where they currently are, then you can use the prevent default. Okay? And if you do that, that'll keep the default event from happening. So in other words, it'll stay on the page that it was on. Again, there's some incompatibility here between the way this is used and the way that it's used in IE. So you can see there's the new way, there's the old way. All right. Back in Chapter 5, we worked on an application that was called an FAQ application. FAQ for frequently asked questions. All right. That application displayed or it hid answers to frequently asked questions about JavaScript and jQuery. What's shown in this chapter is an update of that application that uses techniques with some of the stuff we've been talking about in this chapter to attach events and prevent the default action of its hyperlinks. So what you see on your screen and also in figure 13.4 on page 403 is the user interface. It's the same one that was created in Chapter 5, but the app in this chapter prevents the default action of the hyperlink elements that are coded within the H2 elements. All right. So in other words, when you click on here, even though they're hyperlinked, you don't want to leave the page. In Chapter 5, all right, this was all under index.html, and when you clicked the question mark, or when you clicked, someplace on that H2, what happened was it changed to index.html #. All right. In this chapter, it doesn't change because of the fact that we use the prevent default. And they do mention on the very bottom of page 402, the author says, if you're curious about an object, you can send it to the console panel. And that's what they're showing in here. This is everything that's in that particular object. All right. And sometimes doing that's a good way to learn about what's going on in there. You can do an internet search, but this is sometimes at least is going to be much more relevant. So what you see on your screen and on page 405 in the book is the library event.js. So this is the event library that the frequently asked question application uses. It uses the techniques that we went over back in Chapter 11 to create an object literal named EVT. This object has a method to attach to an event handler, a method to remove an event handler, and a method to prevent the default action from taking place. All three of these, as you can see, are cross-browser compatible because they use the code that we talked about earlier. If you want to go further than this, chances are pretty good that rather than doing it this way, you'd probably want to use jQuery because you can end up writing a lot less code. The main JavaScript file is shown on page 407 and also on the screen right here. Much of this code is similar to what you saw in Chapter 5. The main difference is the addition of a log function and changes in how the event handlers are attached. The log function that you see on the bottom here in yellow, it's an event handler that takes an event object argument and passes it to the console.log method. So again, you can see it on screen. The log function, however, does not check to make sure that the event object exists. All right, that's because the app assumes you're working with a modern browser. But if you want to make sure it worked with an older browser, of course, you could add the code. All right, there's an onEvent load handler that's in here. The onLoad event, it's similar to what you've seen before. It uses the getElementsByTagName method to get all the H2 tags. Then it loops through the H2 tags to attach the event handler, and it ends by setting the focus on the child hyperlink tag of the first H2 tag. But how it attaches to the event handlers here is different. First, for each H2 tag, it stores a reference to both the H2 tag and the child's anchor tag. Then it uses the attach method of the EVT object to attach several events. It attaches the toggle event to the H2. So again, you click it, you turn it on. You click it again, you turn it off, type of an idea. It also attaches the EVT objects prevent default method, as we talked about before, to the anchor tag's click event, which prevents the page from reloading when one of the FAQ things that are in there are clicked. Next, the code attaches the log function to the click, focus, and on mouse over events of the anchor tag. So really, the event handler the logic of the event handler is pretty much the same as it was back in Chapter 5. Here, though, remember, the named log sends the event object it receives to the console panel so you can take a look at it, review it, etc. And the onload event attaches several event handlers. Okay, this demonstrates how you can attach more than one event handler to an element, and you can attach more than one event handler to a single event. So again, what you see in yellow is basically the new stuff in there, or the newer stuff, I guess, that's in there. So let's shift gears a little bit and now talk a little bit about images. All right. A couple of the tasks that you commonly work with images are creating rollovers and preloading images. All right. An image rollover occurs when the user positions the mouse over an image and the image changes to another image. Then when the user moves the mouse out of the image, it changes back to the original. And I've given this example before. I've seen this. You go out to some kind of a site, which is like a Nutrisystem or whatever, and they've got before and after picture of a person. So you see the before picture, you mouse over them, and boom, they're a lot thinner. That's their after picture, and then you take the mouse out again, and it goes back to the before picture again. Something like that. So you see the mouse over and the mouse out, which are the ones that are typically used with these. So to create these, you want to change the source attribute of an image tag in response to the mouse over and the mouse out. Now these work best when there's two images and they're as close to the same size as possible. Ideally, they are the same size. All right, because if you don't make them the same size, the layout of the page changes in response to the rollover. And again, typically, believe me, you don't want that. All right. Now, one thing I did not do, and I should probably be doing a little bit better job of this than I am, this is Chapter 13. So I'm going onto the virtual desktop here so I can grab the information that's already out there for you on the H drive. I'm sorry, on the P drive, I should say. There it is. Go down to CIS 152.119, fall 2016, source code, book apps. This is Chapter 13. All right, so here's the rollover. We run it. All right, notice what happens when we take our mouse and put them over. All right, mouse over and mouse out. And again, this works very well because the images, as mentioned, are the same size. Another thing that you quite often want to do in here is that you want to, you want to have a JavaScript app that loads an image in response to a user event. All right. And sometimes if you know the user, or many of the users will have a slow connection, it's kind of nice if you can preload images. All right. So an application can download the images before the user event occurs, and that's what's known as preloading the image, or images. Then the browser can display the images without noticeable delays. All right. It might be a little longer delay when you first start, but they shouldn't encounter any problems afterwards. So the logic to do this, sorry, I should get back into where I was. They're starting to show it right here. So again, the idea is when the app preloads images, it loads all of the images that it's going to need when the page loads. And it stores these images in the web browser's cache for future use. When the images are preloaded, the browser can display them on an as-needed basis without any kind of noticeable delay. In order to do this, you start by creating a new image object. All right, you can see that there's an example of that here that's in yellow. Okay, that creates a new empty image node. Then you set the source attribute of that image node to the URL for the image to cause the browser to preload the image. All right, so the examples here use the methods of the event library that we talked about in an earlier in the chapter to attach the image. To actually attach the image handlers. All right, so that's the rollover that we had just looked at. Again, the page displays two images that are defined within a paragraph element. When the user moves their mouse point over either image, the image is rolled and replaced by another image. When it's moved off the image, the original image returns. So here is the associated, what you see on your screen and also on page 413 in the book is the head element and the main element of the HTML file. And then next we see the rollover.js file. This is the main JavaScript file for the application. You'll notice that this create rollover function has three parameters. The first specifies the image tag where the rollover takes place. The second specifies the URL of the second image in the rollover. And third specifies the alt attribute for the second image in the rollover. All right, kind of switching gears again. Let's talk a little bit about timeouts. All right, so if you're following in the book, I'm on page 416. Timers let you execute a function after a specified period of time. Now, when you notice this, when you do this, just so you know, there's a one-time timer, all right, and then there's an interval timer. Now, think about the difference between these. Imagine for a second, I know this isn't how it works, but imagine for a second that when you get up in the morning, let's say that you've got your alarm set for 6. Okay, the alarm clock goes off at 6 and you don't hit snooze, you turn it off. You literally turn it off. Okay, so since you literally turn it off, it's not going to go off again in 9 seconds. It's a one-time timer. Now, why am I telling you that? Because the set timeout timer method creates a timer that calls the specified function once and only once after a certain delay has taken place. And that delay time is in milliseconds, where there's 1,000 milliseconds equals a second. The clear timeout method can be used to cancel a timer that was created with a set timeout method. So maybe you set your alarm for 6 o'clock in the morning and you wake up and it's 1:45, but you're wide awake, so you just turn the alarm off. Type of an idea. On the other hand, and we're going to look at all this in just a second, but on the other hand, when you use an interval timer, the set interval method creates a timer that calls a function each time the specified interval in milliseconds has passed. I'll give you 2 quick examples. The first is one I already mentioned for you. And that is, imagine that your alarm clock goes off and you hit snooze. And let's say it's either 9 or 10 minutes, and then boom, the alarm goes off again. That would be an interval timer. All right. Also, with things like back in the olden days, before there was even Word, there was a product called WordPerfect. And many, many years ago, I remember when literally, if you did not save like every 5, 15, whatever it was, minutes, it would save for you, type of an idea. All right. You can't modify an interval timer, but you can cancel it, and you can create a new one if you want to. So here's, in this particular example, the example in the figure shows you how to use an interval timer to create a counter that's going to be incremented every second. All right, and again, would you necessarily want to do that? I don't know, but you could. All right. So the chapter ends here. There's one more thing, and it talks about a slideshow application. It starts on page 420, and it goes for the last 6 pages of the chapter. And here it is. Now, this is a real bona fide slideshow. So if we take a look at it, and that's not what I want to look at. I want to go back to here. And we bring up, and we run. Notice again, not very much HTML. All right. So you'll notice it's happening automatically. It's changing every X number of seconds. Looks like about every 3 seconds or so. I can pause it though if I want to. Now it'll stay here. If I want to enjoy this picture, then I can resume it, which tells it to continue again. All right. Now again, they're showing you how to do this in this chapter, and they're showing you how to do it utilizing JavaScript. I will tell you the chances are pretty good once you learn this stuff, you'll be looking for a faster way of doing it. And that faster way of doing it is to use a plugin. There are a lot of jQuery plugins that will create a slideshow for you. Much simpler, really, much simpler than the way that they're showing you in this chapter. But as the saying goes, sometimes you got to learn to walk before you can run. And sometimes, at least, it'll make more sense to go over something like this first. So the HTML is shown right here on the next slide. The script elements in the head section link to 3 JavaScript files. The event library, a slideshow library, and the main JavaScript file. The main element contains a heading tag and 3 paragraph tags. To keep things simple, the app doesn't adjust the image's alt attribute, but in the real world, you'd probably want to do that. So if we look at what's in here, starting on page 422, we see the library underscore slide underscore show file. All right, this first comes in and it creates an object literal called slideshow that provides the properties and methods necessary for the slideshow. The timer property holds a reference to a timer. The nodes property contains an object with properties named image and caption, which holds references to the image and span tags. The image property contains an object with 2 properties, an array named cache and a number named counter. The last 2 properties that you see in there are play and speed. The play property, which is a Boolean, indicates whether the slideshow is playing, meaning true, or paused, meaning false. And the speed sets the show's speed in milliseconds. So I thought it was every 3 seconds. It looks like it's every 2. After the properties are 6 methods. Most of these return the this keyword, meaning that they can be chained, as we talked about earlier. The load images method accepts an array of slide objects passed to it. Sorry. All right, sorry about that. So So again, load images accepts an array of slide objects passed to it from the onload event handler. Slideshow method uses the arguments property to get its parameters. The stop is next. It passes the timer property to the clear interval to stop the timer. Next is the display new image. And what it does too is it uses a modulus in there. I think it's in the next. And what that's doing is it's basically saying when you get to the end, you want to wrap around again to the beginning. All right, that's the little trick that's used right there. The main JavaScript file is the slideshow, and that's shown on page 425 in the book and also on the screen here. Okay, so since the slideshow is a global object literal, the main JavaScript file doesn't need to create it before using it. Since the slideshow object in the last figure had cascading methods, we're able to chain. We talked about that before. Because the toggle play method is invoked as an event handler, the value of this keyword will be the A element, not the slideshow element. And that's good because that's what the toggle play method expects. So in this example, what the onload event handler does is, again, it first creates an array of objects that contain the information about the images in the slideshow. Next, it passes that array of objects to the slideshow's objects load images method. Next, it passes the image element with the ID of image and the span element with the ID of caption to start the slideshow method, which starts the slideshow playing. Finally, it attaches the slideshow object's toggle play method as the event handler for the click event. Now, by no means do you go through this particular chapter and become an expert on it. All right, but the idea is, at least hopefully what you get out of the chapter, is a better grasp of understanding and being able to at least do some preliminary work with events and images and timers. All right, but again, much of the work that's shown in this chapter, there is absolutely nothing wrong with any of it. But with much of the work that is shown in this chapter, you'd probably be more likely to do the work using jQuery, all right? Better chance you'd use jQuery than some of this JavaScript that's shown right here, all right? So that's it for Chapter 13. When I come back in just a couple minutes, we'll continue on. I will start Chapter 14, one of the harder chapters in the book, because it deals with closures, callbacks, and recursion. I'll be back with that shortly.